Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
Okay, everybody lean in. Lean in. Hello. Welcome to Give the People. Wait a minute. What? We're all together in the same place? Or we've done something fantastic to our screen? No, for the first time ever, historical, look at our own selfie. Give the people what they want, brought to you from People's Dispatch. That's Zoe and Prashant, your your every day, every hour movement news. Best place to go, peoplesdispatch.org. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Super happy to be with you, and it's amazing to be together. Again, this is show 91. 9 shows from now, we'll be at 100. We really expect you, delightful audience, to do something special for us. Treat 100 shows like a better than birthday kind of thing. So you better bang the pans, rattle the chains, make a lot of noise out there. 100 shows coming up. We're with you just outside Sao Paulo, Brazil. Happy to be together. Happy to be with you. Lots of difficult shows, stories to come to you with. This has been a tough period for the international left. Prashant, you have a particularly sad story to recount, partly because you're going to talk about somebody who we all knew personally, who was an avid reader of People's Dispatch. Prashant?
Right, of course, we are referring to Lindokuhle Mnguni, the activist leader of Abahlali Majandolo, the South African shack dwellers movement, and where he was assassinated very recently, very brutal murder, part of a series of murders of activists of that movement that have been taking place. We know of 2 very similar murders this year that took place, Nokotale Basso and Ayanda Anguilla, which took place over the past few months. And it's unfortunate, it's depressing, it's tragic that we keep coming back to these stories again and again, because what we have seen is very clearly a systematic effort, a systematic attempt to target members of this movement. But at the same time, there is no effort by the state to offer them the kind of protection they require, despite the fact that these threats are patently obvious for members of the movement, for anybody who observes the situation right now. And this also brings, I think, every time something like this happens, we talk about this, but the reason these activists, these militants are targeted so systematically is because Abahlali Majandolo is today probably one of the most unique movements around the globe. The fact that it is a movement which tells its members that the people who are homeless are not just recipients of aid, or they're not just passive people who receive patronage or anything, but they're active subjects who take up political agency, who struggle for dignity, who continuously fight, not only for their livelihood but also to be recognized as political actors. And that is at the base of Abahlali Majandolo's work. So, for instance, if you look at the Ekanana settlement with whom Mnguni was so powerfully engaged with, they basically built shacks out of nothing with no support at all. They set up a poultry farm, they set up agricultural produce, farms, they set up a political school, and they built this entire movement, which was really clearly not to the liking of the overlords of the political party in that area. And there have been continuous attacks on them over the past many years. In fact, Mnguni is the 24th leader of this movement to have been assassinated since it was founded in 2005. And that itself is testimony to the fact that this movement is clearly upsetting a lot of powerful people. This movement is clearly seeking to overturn the established order that is there. So very tragic moment for, I think, leftists across the world. In fact, if you read Abahlali Majandolo's statement on the assassination of the activists, it talks about someone who was so constructively and so passionately engaged, not only with the realities of his commune, of his occupation, but with the realities of people across the world. We know for a fact, for instance, that even when he was in prison on unfounded charges, he was twice in prison on unfounded charges. He organized a reading circle inside prison, for that matter. If you also look at the fact that he went to Swaziland as part of a solidarity mission. So keeping all these things in mind, a very tragic moment, but the comrades of Abahlali Majandolo, they're determined that they'll continue the struggle.
Determined to continue the struggle because these are people who are part of the 1 billion people on the planet who live in shacks of this kind. 1 billion people. Everything that they've been asking for, of course, is established in the Sustainable Development Goal. I mean, it's not, Prashant, like they're asking for something that's outside the liberal consensus, which is the right to a house. well, you ask for a right to a house, you get assassinated. That's the state of the world in which we are. Well, Zoe and I have done this show before in the same location. I must admit that at one point we were on our knees, and I, being an older person, found my knees cramping up. This time, I'm happy to say we're sitting in chairs, Zoe. Well, there's somebody sitting in a chair who's been under enormous attack. It's not that Cristina Kirchner has never been attacked before, but this seems to be a particularly vicious attack against her. What's happening in Argentina? So hard to understand all the ins and outs of what's going on.
It is definitely hard to understand, and also it's a little terrifying. So Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, she's currently the vice president of Argentina. As you said, she's been under attack before. She was president of the country, a very divisive figure. She attracted a lot of hate from the right wing in the country because she was fighting for land, housing, and dignity for the people of Argentina. She became president after Néstor Kirchner passed on and then was reelected. And she really tried to speak with the people and have this dialogue. She echoed a lot of Eva Perón, someone who was a leader that was embedded in the masses and responding to the masses and their needs. The Argentinian people emerging from the worst economic crisis in history, and Cristina speaks to them and asks what they need, what they want. And right now, she's been vice president for a couple of years with Alberto Fernández. The government is in an extreme crisis. It's dealing with the debt crisis. It's dealing with a split within the ruling coalition. There's been political challenge after political challenge. At the same time, people in her front are attempting to bring Macri to justice for having stolen the money from the IMF. This is the whole context, but because, as you mentioned, that there's so many attacks against Cristina, she's been one of the foremost victims of Lawfare, which is a process that we've seen across Latin America. We're in Brazil right now. Lula da Silva was one of the victims of this Lawfare campaign. Happened in Ecuador as well. Rafael Correa, Jorge Glass, many people from this progressive wave were hit with corruption allegations, with a series of different accusations because the judiciary has largely been controlled by the right wing under their governments. They weren't able to really shift this. And this right wing judiciary has deep connections to the media, has deep connections to the right wing established power, economic power, launched these campaigns against them. Cristina has dozens, even hundreds of accusations against her for different charges of corruption. There's been many times where there's been threats of, is she going to go to prison? Will she not be able to exercise political roles? And this time, essentially, in this context of great instability, of a lot of divisions within the government, in one of the cases that she's being investigated for, a judge made a ruling that she should be sent to prison for 12 years and be suspended from all political positions. And in response to this, there's been a mass wave of support. There's been, for the past 5 days, members of movements in Argentina, mass movements who are extremely in support of Cristina, have been mobilizing outside of her house in a permanent vigil. Cristina herself made a 3-hour speech to the Congress and outlining how not only is the judge that was calling for her, the prosecutor that was calling her to be investigated has links to Mauricio Macri, but also the judge, and that they're friends and they've played soccer together at the house of Macri. These are important political connections that exist. There's no accident that these people are in cahoots. And at the same time that people that she's politically affiliated with are trying to investigate Macri for the crimes that he committed against the Argentinian people, stealing the money of the Argentinian people to save them from this, economic crisis. And so this is happening. There is an imminent threat that she could be arrested. A possibility does exist of course, the presidential immunity. She is a vice president. She does have this level of immunity. Many say, though, she wants to take this route to show that she's innocent, similar to what Lula da Silva did when he was investigated for corruption crimes and eventually absolved. A lot of different investigations showing that this was a fabricated accusation. This judge, for example, the prosecutors allegedly found evidence, and she's actually uncovered herself, her and her team, that a lot of this evidence was planted, that it wasn't real, that it was manipulated. And so she is very firm in proving her innocence and maintaining that this is a coordinated attack from the right wing, and that she will prove her innocence and be victorious in this case.
And as you've earlier talked about, Argentina, of course, is in the mouth of the IMF, and there's a lot of pressure on Argentina to, in fact, deepen those ties with the International Monetary Fund, to return to Western capital markets. And in a way, the debate inside the ruling coalition has been led by Cristina Kirchner, and the attack on her, in fact, weakens the left inside the coalition because Argentina, like much of the world, is dealing with inflation. We just saw this week in Dhaka scenes that resembled what was seen in Colombo in Sri Lanka. Ganashakti Andolan, for instance, led by Zonaid Saki, on the street there, getting hammered by the police. What were they on the street for? They want to put on the table the fact that inflation rates have gone up. Now, global inflation, according to a new study that's out from UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD shows that global inflation is just about around 2%, 1.8 something percent. But this is a number that makes no sense because it's awfully uneven. I mean, you have Armenia, where the inflation rate is about almost 8% and climbing. Well, what is this inflation based upon? I just want to share with you some data points from the UNCTAD report. The most stunning data point, of course, is food price rise. Since December 2019, food prices have gone up globally 37%. Now, again, it's great unevenness. In some places, what are considered to be staples are no longer within the ability of people to buy them. In Pakistan, for instance, there have been protests upon protests against tax authorities because as staple prices rise, people are just unable to deal with paying taxes or paying, for instance, their electric bills and so on. Electric bills, well, that's important. Crude oil prices since January of this year, up 22%. That's a striking number. But listen, don't take crude oil as a measure of anything. Here's the number that shocked me. Shipping prices up 14%. There's been very little public discussion about this. Why are shipping prices so much higher? Some of it has to do with the fuel price rise. It's not only that, in fact, the disruptions of the pandemic around the shipping industry have not actually been fully settled. So it remains the case that ships are not in a rhythm of carrying goods back and forth. There continues to be an imbalance. There are too many ships in one place, too few ships in another. Shipping companies have been having to fly their crews from port to port to find people to get on board ships and so on. Don't get involved in the details. The base point is, if shipping prices are up, if fuel prices are up, this means food prices are going to continue to skyrocket. This is a catastrophe for countries like Bangladesh, hence the protests. It's a catastrophe for countries like Pakistan, hence the protest. But it's been an even deeper catastrophe. Even though hunger rates have not risen as dramatically in Europe, it's a deeper catastrophe for Europe. It's not just a catastrophe actually for the moment, for now. Now Europe might be able to, in fact, weather some of the storms because they have capital surpluses in the country, they have foreign exchange reserves and so on. But here's the problem that Europe is going to face. Right now, as a consequence of the continued conflict in Ukraine, as a consequence of that, aluminum production has gone to zero. Zinc smelting has gone to zero. Fertilizer production has collapsed. This is going to have an impact not for next year alone, not for the following year alone, but for several years. Because to put production back at a regular footing is going to take time to establish. It can't just be done, in a matter of months. Europe is going to actually have a long-term problem. Many European people, retail analysts and so on have been saying things like Europe is entering a quote-unquote winter recession. That's not a recession for the coming winter, friends. That means a long-term recession which Europe may not be able to recover from. You're getting a lot of this information at places like People's Dispatch and at Globetrotter, partly because many of you might not be going out and reading the financial press where some of this information is available. But I must tell you that the non-financial mainstream press has not been covering the depth of this crisis. And it's in one reason why you see the crisis reflected not in the newspapers as such, but in popular demonstrations. A good reason for you to bookmark peoplesdispatch.org, follow the Globetrotter stories. Good reason for you to do that, because we've been covering the crisis in Sri Lanka, which is in a sense one of the first massive popular uprisings against the inflation. This was an inflation riot that took place in Sri Lanka. It overthrew the government, but that new government that came in essentially remains part of the old regime. They've been at it again. The emergency continues. Now they're arresting students. Prashant, what's happening in Sri Lanka?
Right, Vijay. So you mentioned the inflation issue, and of course, very important to note that inflation has been skyrocketing in Sri Lanka. The overall inflation is in the 60s. Food inflation right now, I think, as opposed to June, is around 82%. It was 75% in June. So what we're seeing is right now definitely an economic crisis that is nowhere close to subsiding in Sri Lanka. And, the government declared a default some months ago. There's some plan of a loan with the IMF. It's going to take a long time to work out. And even if it does work out, the crisis is nowhere close to ending, because we know what the IMF brings. It's more conditions, more austerity, and more suffering. So you would think that the Ranil Wickremesinghe government actually has its hands full with a crisis like this. The country, saw massive protests last week. But what it has been doing is basically attacking anybody who is raising their voice against the government. And the most latest victims were students who stepped out to protest in the third week of August, immediately the day after the emergency that was there for almost a month lapsed. And after these students' protests, police repression took place. Many were detained. A lot of them were released on bail after that. But 3 students, members of the Inter-University Student Federation, student leaders, including Vasanta Mudalige, have been charged with the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Now, this is really, it's incredible on many counts, because on the one hand, what we're seeing is Ranil Wickremesinghe came to power in July after people had very thoroughly and clearly deposed the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government, both his brother as the prime minister and Gotabaya himself. There was this wave of anger against the government at that point. At various points, members of the government had said we will address concerns of the protesters, etc., etc. But from the day Ranil Wickremesinghe assumed the office of the president formally, he has unleashed a wave of repression, a lot of arrests taking place of people who were involved in the protests. He's called people who were protesting as even fascists. And now we have the Prevention of Terrorism Act being used against the student leaders. Now, this is important because, like in many countries across the world, similar Prevention of Terrorism Acts are basically laws which are so vaguely defined, which are so omnibus, that anybody who challenges the government in any way can be branded a terrorist and then is put inside jail. Most of their protections are taken away. And this law, for instance, has a long history of being misused against people of the Tamil minority, for instance. There were attempts to amend the law, but it's still not really worked. So it's actually very telling that at this point of time, at a time when the people of the country are so angry, we have basically a government which chooses to use a Prevention of Terrorism Act, an anti-terrorism act against student protesters. So that really says everything that you need to know about the Ranil Wickremesinghe government. It's basically completely a continuation of what has been happening in the past. And also important to note that Ranil Wickremesinghe became the president with very little to zero legitimacy. He was an MP of a party. He was the only MP of the party when he was made interim prime minister. And then he became interim president. So he's not been elected. He is one of the most unpopular prime ministers of recent times. He's also an equally unpopular president. But instead of trying to address this crisis of legitimacy, what he's been basically doing is attacking protesters. So very tough time for Sri Lankans in the coming weeks and months. On the one hand, this crisis. On the other hand, attempts to speak up being crushed brutally.
This idea of using terrorist laws against protesters and so on at a time of high inflation, not restricted to Sri Lanka. In Pakistan, it's good. Well, I think important to mention that the former prime minister is now facing terrorism charges from the government that overthrew him. This is going to happen more and more. Pakistan, a country that, of course, for off and on punctually had military coups. Another country that had military coups simultaneous with Pakistan was, of course, Chile. Now, we're going to have our show next week, which will also be before the election where the Chilean people will put their thumbprints on whether they want a new constitution or not. But I think it's important to check in on this, Zoe, because, boy, Chile, politics, very interesting and strange.
Definitely. So as you said, on September 4th, the people of Chile, around 15 million voters, will have the option possibility. Well, voting is actually a mandatory, so they most likely will vote in this referendum on the new constitution. And we've talked about this new constitution on prior shows. How did it come about? What's the history? I'll just give a brief history. So the Chilean constitution that is currently in effect was written during the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. And for many Chileans, this constitution really enshrines the unequal neoliberal model which characterizes Chilean society today. Many of the reasons that people participated in the massive uprising in 2019 was precisely because of these demands to have access to education, access to healthcare, public pensions, access to housing, and many other things having to deal with the role of the church, access to abortion, and many other things. And this uprising, one of the concrete, products of it, one of the concrete victories of the uprising was to demand that there be a possibility to rewrite the constitution. And so it's been a very long process from 2019 until now. Throughout this time, we've seen the election of Gabriel Boric, who's a progressive leader, a former student leader, who has, rose to prominence. And really, of course, his victory has to be seen in the context of this uprising. But at the same time, the demand of the Constitutional Convention was also brought forward. And so this is a space that was created during the elections, and people were nominated to participate in this Constitutional Convention, representing diverse sectors of society. So there's certain seats reserved for indigenous people within this Constitutional Convention. And then people really from society. Vijay, you've met a lot of different people that have participated in this Constitutional Convention that came together, over 100 people, to really discuss what are the pressing needs of the Chilean people and how can they be enshrined in the Constitution. It is the first ecological constitution that's ever been written. It enshrines the access to abortion, so many things that were not in the other constitution that they were able to come to consensus about. And unsurprisingly, this constitution, this draft constitution, has been met with a lot of rejection from the right wing. There's been a lot of different campaigns taking place in the media, in those traditional spheres on social media, to really reject this constitution, to spread lies about what kind of society that it proposes to create, similar to what we saw in Colombia in 2016, when the peace agreements were heavily attacked and using ridiculous arguments, which people have been constantly on social media, on the streets, trying to dialogue with people in society to explain really what this constitution demands and is trying to create, which is a better, just, equal society for Chileans, preserving nature and promoting a future where people can live in harmony. They're going to be voting on this on September 4th. And there's been, as I said, hot debate around this constitution. Different, for example, religious groupings have made statements. Gabriel Boric, in light of these controversies that have been really surrounding this constitution, all of the attacks on social media, he's called for national unity in the face of the referendum. It's a really important moment for Chile. It will mark a before and after, and will also be another concrete victory of the uprising, that people were actually able to go to the streets, demand a constitution, write a constitution, and then have that enacted is truly something that has to be recognized. This is not never happened before, but it is definitely something that movements should learn to, is that when you put forward these concrete demands, there can be concrete results. And so it's a exciting moment in Chile, exciting moment in the continent. And we're definitely going to be following the vote, hearing from other people. I'm sure we're going to be publishing some reports on People's Dispatch leading up to this. There's been international campaigns in solidarity with the Chilean people in light of this vote. So it's definitely something to keep watch on.
I mean, it's important to consider, even just as an idea, the fact that a country needs to have a constitution that it can believe in. We are joining you from Brazil, which in fact, after the dictatorship, very quickly wrote a new constitution. They didn't wait for decades, as the Chileans in a way have. They wrote a new constitution. Well, this election campaign is very interesting, and it should be said, it's not merely a presidential election campaign. It's very important, in fact, to say that. It's also a legislative campaign. The reason it's important to say that is one of the candidates in the race, former President Lula, was in a sense removed through a legislative coup. His then successor, in fact, was removed through a real legislative coup. That's Dilma Rousseff. So building an impeachment, barrier inside the Congress is very important in this election. It's not just about who gets elected president. It's how many people of each party are able to secure an impeachment block to prevent impeachment in the legislature. Also, it's important to look at who's going to be the governors, who's going to be winning in local elections and so on. Because Brazil is such a vast country. And in fact, its constitution, we began with constitutions, establishes a country which is not actually a presidential ruled country. In fact, the legislator has more powers in the constitution than the president. But as a consequence of a history of dictatorships and so on, as a consequence of what was done in the immediate aftermath of the dictatorship, president was able to secure a lot of powers. And indeed, Jair Bolsonaro, the incumbent president, has secured even more powers, including preventing investigations of corruption against his own government. Corruption. The issue in this election is twofold. On the one hand, at least in terms of the campaign between Mr. Bolsonaro and Mr. Lula, the campaign revolves around two axes. Number one, Mr. Lula alleges that Bolsonaro is, in fact, not only incompetent, but criminally incompetent, and has led a government which, needlessly allowed for very large numbers of people to die during the pandemic, and in fact, has allowed for a genocidal policy to take place against indigenous people in the Amazon and so on by freeing up mining. That's the argument that Mr. Lula makes, also, of course, saying that he, in 2 terms of office previously in the 2000s, advanced the cause of poor people and so on. That's the case Mr. Lula is making. Mr. Bolsonaro is making the case that, no, wait a minute, Mr. Lula is a corrupt man. In fact, he was imprisoned for a while and so on. In order to establish that, Mr. Bolsonaro is pointing to cases that have been largely dismissed by the judicial authorities. But in fact, because Mr. Bolsonaro has sealed investigations of people in his own administration, there are, quote unquote, no corruption charges against Mr. Bolsonaro because he's, in fact, shut down the possibility of these investigations. So the debate, the axis of the debate around corruption and, in fact, the possibilities of restarting a social democratic agenda in Brazil, it's a heated debate around these axes. And people I spoke to close to the Lula campaign say that it's a very risky election. It's not a slam dunk. The polls are misleading. The polls suggest that Mr. Lula might, in fact, win on October 2nd, which happens to be the birthday of Mahatma Gandhi. But it's not likely that that might happen. They may go to a second round. So the Lula camp is saying it's quite risky. Now, look, I've covered a lot of elections. I know that managing expectations is the key part of electioneering when you're waiting for people to go to the polls. So somehow it's not adequate to say, well, we've got this in the bag. If you say we've got this in the bag, your people might not come out to vote. So they are, in fact, managing expectations. Also, there's a hint of reality here. Very difficult to deal with somebody like Mr. Bolsonaro. And let me quickly give you a reason why. There was a national interview with him. Mr. Lula did the national interview last night, where he was defending his record and so on. When Mr. Bolsonaro did this national interview, anytime there was criticism made of him by the journalist, he said, no, you are purveyor of fake news. He would go to right-wing websites and say awfully offensive things about, LGBT community, women, and so on. When asked by the national news media about those comments, he said, I never said that. It's fake news. Very hard to confront, with sincerity and reason, a candidate like that. It's a tough election. There's a lot that journalists like us have to learn in covering these elections. It's really not enough to say that, well, he's lying, because we have to go under the skin of a society and see how people are taking it and whether they are believing it. I just want to caution, we'll be coming back and Zoe will be in Brazil covering the election, till the and after, I suppose. It's not going to be easy, friends. I really think that it's going to be a tough thing to cover. I'm not talking about the election. It's going to be difficult to cover. But you want reasonable discussion and debate about how difficult it is to cover things, come back and join us. We'll be here next Friday. Give the people what they want. That's you, the people. And we are the ones who try to give you what you want. I don't know if you wanted us all to be together one day, but here we are.
But we didn't want it. So.
But we wanted it. Here's Zoe, here's Prashant, and Vijay. See you next week. Did somebody come in?